Hello, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're exploring rationality. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas. So be sure to check out 1840.org, that's 18forty.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. About a year ago, I got an email from a really dear friend of mine who I've never met, but we exchange emails. Exchange is a strong word. He sends a lot of emails. I probably have a 30% batting average of responding, but I really do love him. He knows that. His name is Jeff Bloom, and he sent me an invitation to participate in a series that I was unable to participate in. I just didn't have enough time, and the intro was so long, but it looked absolutely fascinating. And the entire volume was a consideration of Leo Strauss's introduction to the works of Spinoza. And it was there that Leo Strauss, a great philosopher, you can look him up if you don't know more about him, really a fascinating figure, but he basically undermined Spinoza's critique of Judaism by demonstrating that Spinoza's arguments, like the foundations of Orthodox faith itself, rest upon assumptions which cannot be proven. So he kind of battles it out to this like stalemate of sorts, where, you know, you can't really prove that you're right, and I don't know necessarily that he proved that he was right, but we left with this stalemate, and that was his famous introduction to the works of Spinoza. And what this volume, which is coming out, I think, in a few months, and you should take a look out for it, invited scholars to kind of reflect on this somewhat famous introduction by Leo Strauss, and whether or not this is how we ground our faith in kind of this stalemate where you can't really choose one way or the other, or is there some firmer, rational, some grounding in which we can couch our faith. And there was one contribution in this volume of a name that regrettably I had never heard of, but it was by Simi Peters, who I believe is a doctor. I think she has a PhD. She's definitely written incredible books on Midrash, and her response added another strain of philosophy into the equation and really reframed the entire question itself, and considered how we can ground any sort of faith, particularly in light of postmodernism. Now, before we explain what postmodernism is, I think, number one, this could have its own series, and one day we will. There are so many incredible thinkers who integrate postmodern thought with Judaism, probably most famously Rav Shimon Gershon Rosenberg, known as Rav Shagar, who's done incredible work in this, and so many of his students who have translated his works into English, many of which I consider friends, but we're not really going to focus on that specifically. What I really want to focus is meeting and speaking with Simi Peters was an absolute revelation, but I want to talk a little bit about what postmodernism has done in discussions of grounding faith in rationalism. Postmodernism, which is a really tricky word to define because the philosophy itself in many ways eschews, don't think I pronounced that word correctly, but I always see it in print and I love writing it, but rejects, so to speak, a lot of definition. It rejects the grand narrative, so to speak, that, you know, if you look at old television shows, if you read old books and odysseys, there is this kind of very classic progression from doubt towards truth. And the narrative in which our lives were founded upon was that there was this objective truth that could be obtained. And postmodernism, in all of these kind of curious, somewhat cynical, with meta-references, all these interesting ways, kind of question the very notion of objective truth itself. I don't know if this is a good example, but it's the piece of dialogue that I always think of when I think of postmodernism, and that is the famous philosopher Saul Goodman, as featured in Breaking Bad, when he explains what personal truth means to him.
If you're committed enough, you can make any story work. I once convinced a woman that I was Kevin Costner, and it worked because I believed it.
The notion of having my truth, whether it's your truth and your relationship to your religion, whether it is your truth and your relationship to your own status, be it that you're a great scholar or very brilliant or Kevin Costner, but this idea that you have the right and authority to ground your experience in whatever your subjective and personal truth is definitely a wrench in the very question of whether or not there is a capital T truth with which we can even uncover. And personally, when I think of postmodernism, I actually think of a fabulous series by a video essayist, which is a real term. It's a video essay. He's actually the first person I reached out to when we were doing 1840 videos. He wasn't available, but his videos are some of the most profound things I have ever watched online. Genuinely profound, really deals with incredible questions. His name is Will Shoder, Will. Shoder is spelled Schoder. And he has a series of videos. He hasn't put out that much in a while, but I find his stuff incredibly profound. And he has a video entitled David Foster Wallace, The Problem with Irony. David Foster Wallace, the great novelist, writer. He started his career as a mathematician. He was a tennis star. I'm really fascinated by his life. He's had some negative accusations about him, which I prefer not to litigate right now. But his thought, particularly on this issue, I have found incredibly, incredibly profound. His life, unfortunately, ended quite tragically. Died at a very young age. But his thought in this regard, for me at least, has been quite profound. And I want to share with you the way Will Shoder in this video kind of frames the thought of David Foster Wallace, particularly as it relates to postmodernism.
The problem is, I think postmodernism has to a large extent run its course.
David Foster Wallace is known for being one of the most influential writers in recent history. Before taking his own life in 2008, he decried the negative effects postmodernism had on his generation. Postmodernism is a very wide-ranging term used to analyze our world that emerged in the 1950s and 60s. It rejected the grand narratives that exist in modernism, things like there is one true God, history is progress, and peace on earth. In postmodern thought, there is no scientific, philosophical, or religious truth which will explain everything for everybody. It lacks that optimism. Instead, everything is understood on a micro level. Knowledge and truth are contextual and constructed. Reality only comes into existence through our interpretations of what the world means to us individually. Thus, postmodernism is characterized by self-referentiality, such as a character who knows they're a character in a novel or film, by moral relativism, and by cynicism and irony. With that in mind, here's Wallace again.
The problem, though, is that a lot of the shticks of postmodernism, irony, cynicism, irreverence, are now part of whatever it is that's enervating in the culture itself, right?
Wallace's biggest concern was with the dominant cultural force of television, which he believed had become too saturated with these postmodern characteristics. TV's response to dumb and overly sentimental sitcoms was irony. TV shows began criticizing themselves for being dumb TV shows.
I think there's a similar bind if you listen closely to this, and once again, I really want to recommend going online and checking out some of his videos, because he deals with so many of the issues that, at least for me personally, about consciousness, happiness, irony, postmodernism, philosophy, but in this really creative way that I find wonderful. So shout out to Will Shoder. Again, Will and Shoder spelled Schoder. I find his videos to be incredibly profound, and he's really trying to uncover the basis of meaning itself. But I do think there is a similar bind that both rationalism and postmodernism leads you to, which is the ability to really choose and commit to a specific set of practices, commitments with which you can build sacredness. It's what so much of the irony and, the television shows that I love, I mean, don't get me wrong, BoJack Horseman, Arrested Development, they're all contending with these issues of that postmodernism, the show about a show, the life about a life, where we are afraid to invest in our specific own lives. Maybe it's because of our own cynicism, maybe it's because we don't have any rational basis to choose issues in the particularity of our own experience, and there is a universalism that everybody holds truth, and committing yourself to one specific practice, one specific set of ideas, seems to undermine not just rationality, but I think in many ways this very notion of postmodernism. You don't have access to a capital T truth. You're not part of some grand narrative that has this sincere meaning. You are part of a show of many other shows. And this notion of kind of referencing back on your own experience and undermining the sincerity of your own lived experience, I think is something that postmodernism and very often rationalism can be guilty of. I love the quote from David Foster Wallace where he kind of warns of the corrosive effects that culture, that cynical culture particularly, and that cynical culture both in television and movies, but also in contemporary writings and the way people speak. Our ability to connect and commit to truth has become more and more difficult. This is what he says. Few artists dare to try to talk about ways of working towards redeeming what's wrong, because they'll look sentimental and naive to all the weary ironists. Irony's gone from liberating to enslaving. There's some great essay somewhere that has a line about irony being the song of the prisoner who's come to love his cage. In many ways, we're afraid to actually commit, and I love this, to redeeming what's wrong. And we spend all of our time in our lives pointing out with different methodologies of this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, but without any coherent approach that allows us to invest with sincerity and redeem what we find wrong. What he writes elsewhere, hip, cynical transcendence of sentiment is really some kind of fear of being really human. I want to say it again because in some ways I think these struggles between balancing rationality, postmodernism, integrating our philosophies with our actual lived experience, finding a methodology to choose and live a meaningful life. These are the very battles of what it means to be a human being. And battles, I don't mean vanquishing one methodology over the other. I don't mean balancing the right from the wrong. I mean integrating this into a real lived experience that is couched ultimately in something that is more than yourself. That we shouldn't all descend into this solipsistic view that it's only my truth, but that we can be connected to something greater. I just want to read it again because I find it to be so powerful. Hip, cynical transcendence of sentiment is really some kind of fear of being really human. And I think this fear of really being human, this fear of embracing our humanity with all of its irrationality and rationality, with all of its fragility and vulnerability and all of its analytic power and prowess, is for many people the great fear of the 21st century. It is for many people the uncertainty and anxiety that we find now where we are in competition with computer science, where we spend so much of our time trying to outpace the perfection that we are able to simulate in the world of computers, artificial intelligence, wherever you want to put it, that we are almost afraid to embrace what really makes us unique, which in many ways is our fragility and our ability to reflect on our very own fragility. Like that great quote that I've shared with you before, where Brian Christian, who wrote the book The Most Human Human, which I've recommended 1,001 times. If you haven't read it already, it's just a whopper of a book. It's about somebody who competes in a Turing test. The Turing test was kind of created by Alan Turing, where somebody speaks to a group of computers. You're speaking to computers and a human being, and you try to figure out which are the computers and which are the human beings. Turing posited that one way of simulating artificial intelligence is a computer is able to convince a panel of judges that they are in fact the human being and not the computer. And this book, The Most Human Human by Brian Christian, is about somebody who competed not as a computer, but he competed as one of the human beings, as the Confederates. And he had to convince a panel of judges communicating solely through text. There's no voice modulation that you can hear and decide what's what, but solely through text, and to have to prove his humanity. And it's a great thought experiment. Like, what would you do if you had to prove your humanity to a group of judges solely through text? What would you write? What would you speak about? And after writing this book, he had an interview with the Paris Review where he reflected on his own experience. And he was kind of asked, like, so what in fact makes human beings unique? And I loved his answer. He said, human beings appear to be the only things anxious about what makes them unique. It's that anxiety, that vulnerability that we have about establishing lives that do have some sacredness, some specialness to them, that I think makes us uniquely human. And I think in many ways, especially now, contending with the uniqueness of human experience is sometimes really contrasted with what computer science and singularity and all of these things that you may or may not know about, what prizes them. Like that famous interview at the World AI Conference in Shanghai, Elon Musk said that there is a smaller and smaller corner where humans are better than computers in intellectual pursuit, and every year it gets smaller and smaller. Humans, he said, are hopelessly inadequate. And rather than looking at that in these discussions about finding that capital T truth and looking at that hopelessly inadequate, our hopeless inadequacy is not, I think, a bug of our system. It is a feature. It is part of the distinctive human experience, and learning how to embrace that and integrate that with all of the intellectual prowess of what makes human beings unique, I think is a really beautiful part of life. And I think what makes being alive today in the 21st century, when we see these developments in technology, in modernity happening so rapidly, is really learning how to be proud and embrace the very nature of our human condition. And I think that's so much about what we've been discussing over here, to learning how to appreciate what makes humans human. And whether it's with postmodernism and whether it's with rationality, I think these questions have become more and more difficult, especially as of late. There's one thought that I really like as it relates to the value add of religion, particularly as a response to rationality and postmodernism. And you may not like this. It's not a response. It is something that I believe religious life offers that otherwise is very hard to cultivate in your own life. And it's something that A.J. Jacobs, who's a really fun author who wrote this fabulous book called The Year of Living Biblically, where he spent a year literally following the Old Testament. You could read it on your own. I definitely got a chuckle. I wouldn't give him a high marks for his fidelity to Old Testament Judaism. You could read it yourself. It's got some great cameos of Shatnez and all this other fun stuff. It's a great read if you haven't read it already. And I love A.J. Jacobs. I know he's a friend to a lot of people. I know he does really some wonderful work. But in a talk, I believe a TED Talk following the publication of his book, he spoke a little bit about what he learned from this experience of following the tenets of the Old Testament, at least to the best of his understanding, for a full year. And there's one thing that always stuck out at me, and it was the word sacredness.
Thou shalt have reverence. This one was not unexpected because I started the year as an agnostic, and by the end of the year I became what a friend of mine calls a reverent agnostic, which I love. And I'm trying to start it as a movement, so if anyone wants to join. The basic idea is whether or not there's a God, there's something important and beautiful about the idea of sacredness, and that our rituals can be sacred, the Sabbath can be sacred. This was one of the great things about my year, was doing the Sabbath, because I am a workaholic, so having this one day where you cannot work, that changed my life. So this idea of sacredness, whether or not there's a God.
I think our ability to find sacredness and find the sacredness in our lives can be much more difficult and much harder to discover if we get lost in a world of postmodernism, where you can get lost in attaching your own story to any larger story and any grander narrative of truth. And it can be even harder when you become mired in the propositions and the kind of cold reason of rationality. And finding that sacredness in your own experience, in your own story, and attaching yourself to some larger feeling of sacredness, I think in many ways is something that is overlooked and ignored in our personal lives. And sacredness is not something that can ever be manufactured. Sacredness is something that arises organically, I think, particularly when you connect not only to your own present experience, but to the larger experience of the past and the future, linking them together. And I believe that there is no greater way to develop that sense of sacredness for life and of life than with a relationship with Torah and mitzvos, halacha and Yiddishkeit, I think really allows people to transform the ordinariness, the mundaneness, the almost meaninglessness of a superficial look of life into something quite sacred. It also happens to be the approach of our guest, Simi Peters, whose essay in the yet unpublished volume is entitled Why Should a Jew Choose Belief? And I never heard of her before, but I found her so incredibly profound, thoughtful. I went out immediately and bought her book on Midrash, which of course we will try and link to. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our guest, Simi Peters. So I am so excited to introduce somebody who I'm only familiar with from one fabulous unpublished essay that she wrote that was sent to me by a dear friend of mine, Simi Peters. Is it okay if I call you Simi?
Nobody calls me anything else, so that's perfect.
Okay, I am so excited to talk with you today about the struggle of grounding Jewish faith, whether that grounding is grounded in something rational, if it's something supernatural. I want to talk about that with you today, but before we get to it, I had never heard of you before I read this. You have this 20-page, we'll see how long it comes in, this contribution to an unpublished book, a collection that's coming out about the contemporary philosophical basis of Judaism. So before we get into your actual essay, maybe you can tell me, us, our audience, a little bit about where you were raised, where you were from, and why are you writing about this? And then we'll get into why now and what exactly you're arguing.
Okay, well, I sort of asked Jeff Bloom why he wanted me to write for his book because my field is Tanakh, Midrash, and Parshanut, which is Bible and Midrash and biblical commentators. That's my thing. I've written a book on Midrash called Learning to Read Midrash. It could be that if you taught Tanakh, you'd be a little more familiar with my work because teachers, do use the book or have studied the book. I know that from feedback I've received. My background is my parents were Holocaust survivors. I grew up in New York, Far Rockaway, New York, from a Haredi background. Yeah, I know you're from.
I grew up in
You
Lawrence,
grew up in Lawrence, but
right across the highway.
you're younger than me.
We missed each other.
We missed each other. I've been in Israel since I finished graduate school. I have a degree in linguistics, a BA and an MA in linguistics. And I made Aliyah as soon as I finished graduate school. I've been in Israel 42 years now, something like that. I'm a mother, grandmother, teacher, a passionate missionary for reform in Jewish education, especially when it comes to the way that Midrash is taught. Does that give you enough background information?
That is more than enough, and I'd love to do a deep dive and play some more Far Rockaway Jewish geography, but that of course can wait for a different time. What I wanted to talk about is you have, again, this is unpublished now, but you have an article that's entitled Why Should a Jews Choose Belief? And I think the question I wanted to start with is the question itself that you are addressing. You note from the outset of your article the question, why do you believe? Why have faith? Why be committed? Why be involved in Yiddishkeit, in religion in any way? Is not a question that is asked a lot in Orthodox circles. It's not asked a lot in a lot of religious communities. It's almost presupposed. It's taken for granted. My question that I want to ask is, has something changed that we need to address this question now? And if so, what has changed that all of a sudden this question that for much of Jewish history, when I was growing up, a lot of this was taken for granted. It wasn't fully articulated. So why is this a question that, in your opinion, needs addressing now?
I think it always needed addressing. That's the truth. I believe it always needed addressing and it didn't get addressed. But I think that the influence of postmodernism has, even on the most insular religious Jewish communities, has made this question a necessary question, or addressing this question necessary. Because
Could you just explain what exactly do you mean by postmodernism before you explain how that's necessitated addressing the question.
Okay, broadly speaking, postmodernism is a movement. When did it exactly start? That's an interesting question. Certainly, it took off big time in the 80s, 1980s. It was a movement that sought to undermine the foundations of accepted wisdom or accepted belief in Western society. So, to give a sort of a potted history here, the Greeks believed that people could be objective and they could prove things. They could prove in the mathematical sense, right? Like, there's empirical proof. You can prove everything empirically. Postmodernism challenged that. And it evolved into a kind of radical subjectivity where basically all truths have equivalent, or all narratives have equivalent weight. No assumptions can be proven at all whatsoever, which by the way I think is true, but that's a separate issue. And what postmodernism did was it kicked the guts out of the certainties of just about every institution of religion, education, philosophy, pick your sort of if you will sacred cow. It kicked the guts out of all of that by simply saying you can't prove it, and therefore it has no foundation.
You use the term the indeterminacy of knowledge, that,
Mhm.
so much is couched in our lived experience and what you've been through and how you've raised
Mhm.
and all of the
Mhm.
subjective forms of your narrative.
Mhm.
So uncovering and discovering some objective truth for all through the lens of this theory is nearly impossible.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. Because let me say this, I actually think that a belief in the indeterminacy of knowledge, in the sense that we are all subjective, right? We're all a filter our understandings through subjective experiences, through our minds, our bodies, the ways in which we experience the world. I don't think this idea was radical to Chazal. I think they assumed it. I think they assumed, as opposed to the Greeks, who assumed that you could really, really be objective in some pure sense, which, if you think about it, is kind of a crazy idea. Like, where did they get that certainty from? But for Chazal, I don't think that that's an issue. I think for Chazal, though, for the sages of the Talmud, for traditional Jewish thought, of course, we're subjective, right? We're not people. We can't claim some pure Olympic, objectivity. I don't think that's the radical idea. I think the radical idea, and where postmodernism did a tremendous amount of damage to society, was in saying if you cannot prove or you cannot assign a truth value to a statement, then it has no validity at all. Does that make sense? Should I clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, you add on 2 sentences. You're not just speaking to me, we're speaking to our audience, but I think these are questions that a lot of people are grappling with in their religious faith. And younger listeners are growing up in this postmodern
Oh yeah.
world. So even
Oh
if they
yeah.
don't put a label on it,
Oh
to
yeah.
understand how that universe is shaping their own commitment and the lens through which they see Yiddishkeit, I think is really important. So say another few words on how exactly this is influencing the way we look at our religious commitment and religious thought.
Okay. So you first of all, you keep using the word commitment, which is what is necessary to belief, right? Basically, commitment, what makes us believe is that we've committed to a system of belief, and therefore we invest in it and we use it in our lives. All right, let me see if I can give an illustration from working as a teacher. Okay. As a teacher, I've been teaching for 40 years. Okay.
Wow.
Students who have studied under me, in the past took it for granted that you could prove, and I'll say that in air quotes, you could prove things and you could argue your case and you could interpret texts, that some interpretations were better than others, that some ideas are better than others, that some ideas have more validity. What today that has just, as part of the zeitgeist, part of the sort of the spirit of the age, is that's just not true. Why? Because since no single belief system can be proven mathematically or philosophically to be absolutely true with a capital T, then all are equivalent, right? Since you can't, it's almost like saying, if we take the anti-vaxxers, as maybe this is a sensitive example.
No, let's jump right in there.
Okay. Conventional wisdom, right? When I was growing up and when I started my teaching career was that doctors knew what they were talking about, or certainly they knew more than your bubby, right? Like if you had now medicine is not an exact science. Nobody would say that even today, but if you had an infection, you took penicillin because the use of medicine or medicine, surgery, whatever medical means were used was based on study, empirical proof, attempts to get at, to sort of pare down treatment to something that really worked, not something that was like, okay, let's throw this, let's give this person arsenic. Maybe it'll
Yeah.
kill the infection, but that there was a solid basis for that. Today, you have people who say things like, look, I read the internet, I've read books about vaccination, and I make up my own mind. It's very hard to be a doctor today because of the internet, right? The first thing a person does when they find out that they've been diagnosed with something is they Google it,
WebMD.
right?
Yeah.
They Google it, and then they think they know, or they don't even know which website they're using. They don't know what the website is basing the information on. But the assumption is, well, my doctor says this, but the internet says the following 10 things. And I don't have to, they're all equivalent. Every narrative is equally kosher.
And to shift to the analog of our conversation, meaning it
Mhm.
would be that when you would listen to a parent, a teacher, a rabbi, there was maybe more of an implicit understanding
Consensus.
or consensus
Yeah.
that this is capital T true.
Right.
And now, when it does not cohere with your lived experience, it's much easier to feel a sense of alienation and saying, look, I want something that resonates more with my personal lowercase t truth.
Right.
And that has made the question of why affiliate with Orthodox Judaism, is there still a capital T truth that this can be grounded on, much more, it's muddied the waters. It's made it a little bit more
Absolutely.
difficult.
Absolutely. So I would say, if I were to just take a little bit issue with what you're saying here, a Jew believes there is an absolute capital T truth, but it does not reside in the human mind, right? It's in God, right? But lo bashamayim hi, it's not in the heavens. In other words, this is implicit in the methodology of Chazal, the sages of the Talmud, and Jewish thought from their time to our time. Implicit is, of course, we're all sitting here trying to figure out what the truth is based on the texts that we accept as the word of God that will tell us what the truth is. But guess what? Rabbi X says this, and Rabbi Y says that, and Rabbi Z says the other. And then there are rules by which we decide what the halachic, what the legal implications are. But capital T truth, resides in God's mind, right? In God, in the reality of God. And as human beings, we try to approximate that to the best of our ability using revealed truth of God as far as we can apprehend it.
So let me jump in, and this has definitely shaped the way people believe. And let me try to present a question that my partner, really, in this entire project, Mitch, he uses the following analogy, and his frustration is that he's looking to apprehend with his own mind the capital T truth.
Mhm.
And his frustration is that he looks at history and the beginnings of rabbinic Judaism and how it flourished, more or less around the same time of Christianity and other religions. And what his question is, look, I can't really apprehend what we're doing is any better than what other people are doing. So what am I left with? Am I just a part of some, I think he uses the Great Wolf Lodge, or, this fraternity of bros coming together, and, we have cholent, we make kiddush, and we're part of this community that has this communal norms. But so does my golf club, so does my country club. There are other places where I can find this affinity and these, social norms or whatever it is. So how do I extract and find some measure of capital T truth to ground my faith in, so it doesn't feel like my affiliation with Judaism, as satisfying as it may be, as enjoyable as it may be, is more than just being an affiliate of a country club? Can that still be found, and where do you look to to find it?
Well, I can give you my answer to that question, my personal answer, and I think my personal answer has wider implications. I hope it does. First of all, one of the things I say in the article is the experiential. I like being from vibe. I'm comfortable in the from world is not enough to ground somebody who doesn't like being from. For one thing, that the Jewish community is great, and there's a tremendous cultural richness and a love and warmth and terrific things. There's also a lot of dysfunction. A community can be dysfunctional just like a family can be dysfunctional, right? Talmud Torah is very intellectually satisfying, but for some people it's frustrating, it's hard. Keeping mitzvot is not always, fun. Sometimes, even if you're deeply committed. I remember at my first son's brit, I suddenly thought, and I'm from a Hasidish, family, Holocaust survivors, like I've been a frum girl my whole life, base Yaakov girl, the whole thing. I thought they're gonna cut my baby, and I was not a happy bunny, and yet I didn't grab my child and run home. I mean, there's something there that has to hold you through the tough moments. I mean, maybe a good analogy is marriage. And this isn't my answer, but a good analogy might be marriage. You get married, you make a commitment, and then you make it work because unless it's really, a terrible marriage, obviously abusive or whatever. I think the problem is that people couch these issues in terms of is it true with a capital T or even true with a small t, or why is my truth more important or better than someone else's truth? And I think it would be better if we use the terms evidence and judgment instead of proof and truth. In other words, the question that I think what Judaism demands of a Jew is to exercise judgment all the time, right? We have a body of texts, we have a tradition, we have oral texts and written texts, we have a tradition, we have a history and a heritage. And the question that we have to ask ourselves all along is how do I exercise my judgment about right or wrong here? Okay. Not is this truth with a capital T, but perhaps is this right or wrong? Is this meaningful or not meaningful? Is this what I should be doing? Okay. And the way that I sort of frame it, and if you read the article, I think you saw this, is for me, the evidence, if you will, that makes Judaism reasonable is a sense of Jewish history, and that has been beaten to death. Also, I'll forgive me for a minute while I just sort of clarify what I mean here. The use of the Shoah to create commitment in Jews is, I think, a perversion of what we're supposed to get out of Jewish history, right? It's a big problem. Be a Jew because Hitler was going to kill you, so would have killed you, so you should be a Jew. That's not what's interesting to me in Jewish history. What's interesting to me in Jewish history is why we haven't disappeared. And I'm not talking about anti Semitism here. I'm talking about why have the Jewish people persisted in or insisting on remaining Jewish, even though it really doesn't make sense and it doesn't pay in worldly terms. Why haven't we disappeared? Now, I remember my father was a Holocaust survivor, said that somebody had quoted some professor in Harvard saying something very damning about religious belief. And he said, when Harvard is a pile of rocks, there still will be little Jewish boys with payas. So, like, you should, and I think that's a true statement. Now, the Rambam in his Hilchot Yisodei Torah, Maimonides in his magnum opus, right, talks about the foundations of Jewish belief. And he says that our belief in God is based on the experience at Sinai, right? That the whole people witnessed God giving the Torah. And when God gave the Torah, that created a tremendous impression upon the Jewish people. And they passed that down to their children, and it's quite a good argument. And the Kuzari has a similar argument. He talks about the fact that it was a mass revelation and why that is proof of God's existence and the truth of Torah. Now, for a postmodern person, and maybe not even just a postmodern person, where basically history is written, how many people have said something like history is written by the victors, or history, well, in our case, history is written by the survivors,
Mm-hmm.
that is still, if you will, that is still not a knockdown, drag out proof. Okay?
Meaning somebody could say, of course you're able to, couch it in Sinai or in this mass revelation because, it's like this Abraham walled, when he was looking at the airplanes coming back. We're only looking at who survived, and the only people who are going to survive are the ones who lay truth to these, big, massive truth claims. But that doesn't necessarily give it any real credence.
Exactly. Exactly. And while I personally find Maimonides' argument persuasive, some could say to me, sure, you've been indoctrinated from a young age to believe that the Torah was given at Sinai. It was transmitted through
You're
generation.
invested in this.
You're invested in it. It's your thing, right? It's your identity. But there is one thing that I think can't be so easily explained. And again, it's not the fact that we as a people have survived anti-Semitism, the wars, I mean, Jewish history is a nightmare, right? It's not just that we have survived Jewish history, but that we chose. There are still Jews today, and there have always been Jews, and the number waxes and wanes, and individual Jews have often dropped out of Jewish history. That's not a surprise either. But between those twin poles of emancipation on the one hand, the siren song of assimilation on the one hand, and anti-Semitism on the other, why are there still Jews doing this? Why are we still invested? Right? Why haven't we disappeared? And to me, that's the evidence of Sinai. In other words, for me, the fact is that this sort of Jewish stubbornness, again, as a people, I'm not talking about individuals, but as a people, that God intoxication, that willingness to see God in history, that we continue and repeatedly we keep dying and we never die, right? What did Toynbee call us? A fossil? We're more like the phoenix, right? We don't give up on God. And that to me feels supernatural. That's the real miracle of Jewish history, as far as I'm concerned. That the Jewish people are the miracle of Jewish history, their belief and their faith in God and their willingness to maintain this. And I think you can't ignore that. You can't ignore that. That is the, if you will, echo of the Big Bang that was Sinai. That for me is the basis of belief. That's enough for me to commit because I remember saying this once to a student. She was horribly shocked. I said, look, if I didn't think God really gave us the Torah at Sinai, I'd party. I wouldn't- no Shabbos, no kashrus, none of that stuff. There's other things to do out there. That's my answer.
Why is that argument from history not equally applicable to Islam or Christianity?
Go for it, Muslim or Christian. You don't have to be a Jew, and my revelation is not directed at you. In other words, if you have a coherent approach to your tradition and a sense of grounding in it, and you have invested time to understand it, go for it. you know I don't think that the truth, that's one of the interesting things. I don't think the truth of Torah was intended for the world, except sort of in a broader sense. It doesn't, the fact that a Muslim eats halal rather than kasher is legit.
That is fascinating. The question that I'm concerned now, I can see you, our listeners cannot. You told me you were raised in Far Rockaway by Holocaust survivors. You mentioned you have Hasidic heritage.
Yes.
What is a good from Beis Yaakov girl doing, trying to figure out and justify faith, quoting Spinoza and Leo Strauss and postmodernism? What led you to explore these questions? If I were to pass by you in Israel, and you told me you teach Midrash or Tanakh,
I look like a Rebbitzin.
I would believe you right away. If you told me you wrote a 20-page article trying to ground Jewish faith in something philosophical and rational, I would say, are you sure you have the right Simi Peters? I met the Rebbitzin. She was going around. Maybe that's my own gendered bias, and I have no doubt that specifically on these questions, gender plays a very real role.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know you well enough, and I was hoping that the answer to this question would come out from that brief history you gave before, but it's only made my question more pronounced. What am I missing that you were drawn to these massively large questions, couched in a very sophisticated philosophical grounding? And I apologize if the very very question that I am asking is very likely grounded on my own lived experience and what a Rebbitzin supposed to look like and be interested in. I will admit to that upright, and I apologize for asking the question, but I
It's
couldn't
okay.
help myself from
I've
surfacing
been
it.
asked it before. Somebody sent me a letter after I wrote my book asking a little bit about my background. Where had I come up with my approach to midrash? And I said, well, I'm a former Beis Yaakov girl, and and I did this and this. I studied with this one and that one and whatever. And he said, you don't write like a Beis Yaakov girl. So okay, so fair enough.
So maybe I misunderstand. And I have high esteem for Beis Yaakov. I
I
have
so do
sister,
I. So do
the
I. I learned all
highest.
my Torah in Beis Yaakov.
So it's not a knock on that, but I feel like there's a part of your story and what's drawing you to these questions that I am still missing.
Okay, so if I'm very frank, I will say that someone once said to me, I was in my teens, late teens, and a friend of mine, and she said, "What's your big Yetzer Hara? Like, what's the thing that really tempts you?" I said, "Western culture." Like from a very young age, I was fascinated by Western culture. I love literature, right? I'm a big reader. I was fascinated by the way that Western culture, the best of Western culture. I mean, I read junk too, but Western culture is extremely seductive, especially for a nerdy kid. And I was very drawn to Western culture, Western literature, Western thought. Let's face it, growing up in America, if you're not hermetically sealed, it's not Mea Sharim, you're exposed to Western culture. That's where you come from. And at the same time, I have a very, very strong, Baruch Hashem, a very strong grounding in learning. And I love Torah. I love learning. By the way, the gender thing, just to point out, the reason I was asked to write for this book is because it's hard to find women who will do this kind of thing. A lot of the younger women scholars are younger and have little kids and stuff. I have this. I'm fortunate in being an older product, a self-made product of a certain kind of learning. And for that reason, if I were a man, I don't know if I would have been asked to write for this book. But what I was passionate about was trying to understand what my relationship to Western culture should be. And as a teacher who taught Chozrot B'Tshuva, not only Chozrot B'Tshuva, I've taught in a variety of places,
People who come back like a
people
Balchuva,
who
yeah.
come back to well, or never really knew Judaism but are exploring
Yeah.
Judaism. The kinds of questions that my students asked me, especially in the early years of my teaching before the internet took over and people actually read books and had a thirst for reconciling these difficulties, meant that I had to think about a lot of things. I had to think about a lot of things. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was something that really, really drew me, the intellectual challenge of trying to reconcile that bicultural reality, two strong pulls in my personal experience.
I guess just to stay on that personal component for a moment, to me, a lot of people who are drawn to the nuance and sophistication that is more readily apparent in, the great canon, Western literature, can look back at a more sheltered, for a host of reasons, I'm not saying that critically,
Mhm,
upbringing
mhm,
with a sense of cynicism and frustration. Why didn't you tell me this earlier? Why
mhm,
didn't you
mhm.
expose me to these ideas earlier? So I guess my follow-up question to you, because you don't seem this way, and maybe, again, you have just such a gracious cadence to your voice that maybe I'm missing it. Why are you not more cynical? Meaning you were raised in
I'm
a,
very cynical. I'm very
uh,
cynical. No, I'll tell you, it's funny. A friend of mine who is a Chozeret B'Tshuva, she's a wonderful educator here in Yerushalayim. She came to Judaism as in late teens through NCSY, Dafka.
specifically, yeah.
A very knowledgeable woman. She's great. She's wonderful. After one of the after one of the horrible scandals with the rabbi who was taking advantage of young women came to light, I met her in the supermarket and she said to me, "Doesn't this shake your faith? Like, doesn't this just really kill you?" And I said, no, I'm an FFB. I grew up from. I know that from people can be disgusting. I mean, it was hello, no, it doesn't shake my faith. Or let me put it this way. First of all, I had wonderful parents, Baruch Hashem, and I had teachers who gave me a real intellectual challenge. And when you said the nuance in the Western canon, you have to understand I am a teacher of Tanakh, Midrash, and Parshanut. When you have analyzed a Rashi on Torah carefully, when you have peeled apart a Midrash and seen how profound and complex and brilliant it is, I didn't feel like Judaism or my Jewish studies didn't hold a candle. Talmud Torah was always at a high level, very challenging, and I didn't have an inferiority complex about Judaism, but I still found the Western canon fascinating.
Let me ask you this, and maybe this will be my final question, because your article, God willing, will be coming out soon, and it does make a very articulate defense, kind of couched in this historical uniqueness of the Jewish people. But I wanted to ask you, as a teacher, not as the writer of a article coming out in some relatively obscure volume, everybody should buy it.
Yeah, it's
But
going to be obscure.
yeah, but this is not going to be on the New York Times bestseller list. Let me ask you, as a teacher, I've been asking all of our guests this. Do you think, you have people, I don't know where the high schools or whether or not you're still teaching Americans or how much yours is on the scene, but when you think about the way our pedagogical system is set up, and we have, thank God, an unbelievable educational system in the United States of America. We have really, my grandfather, begat, he was involved in Torah Masorah in those early days with Dr. Joe Kamenetsky, in the boondocks in Portland, Maine, and starting, these little communities. But now we're really thriving, but it seems like we still have holes in the boat. We still have leaks in the roof. What do you see are issues specifically related to the grounding of faith that our, whether elementary schools or high schools, should be paying closer attention to, or perhaps doing differently? Or do you see, look, it's exactly right for what we need as a product in America, and then they'll come to Israel on a gap year, whatever, they'll fill in those blanks, and then they'll do the rest.
All right. So, first of all, I would say that while the investment of the American Jewish community in day school education for students is extremely admirable, parents are definitely sacrificing financially and in other ways to make sure their children get a good Jewish education. I do not think that the Jewish educational system in the States or in Israel is thriving. I can't agree with your assessment. I think that a lot of what the educational system in America now does is kiruv within the religious community. There is very little rigor,
Meaning outreach.
outreach to the students, right? The kumsitz or the discussion or the touchy feely, and those things have their place. Absolutely, they absolutely have their place. But if you're not showing your students the rigor of the texts, then you have a problem. Or let me put it this way. I'm seeing students in 18-year-old programs, and I'm teaching these girls, right? I'm seeing students who really don't daven from a sitter. They daven from an art scroll, right? They can't read the texts in Hebrew. They have trouble translating them. There's something there. It's Judaism at a remove. And if you're not giving students good textual skills, then why should they be impressed with their heritage? If you're teaching students, and this I see very much in the modern Orthodox world, more than in the centrist or right wing Orthodox world, if you're telling students things like it's just a midrash, and you're not teaching them to respect Chazal, you don't give them a real grounding. You don't have teachers who can answer the questions they're raising because the teachers haven't studied the texts. Then you're in trouble. You're in
Tell
trouble.
me, what do you think the trouble and the problem that you are seeing? Because it sounds to me that you're not talking about more education in doctrine or theology necessarily.
No.
You would like to see more independence, text-based skills learning. Because why? Without,
Okay.
the average educator, let's just frame the problem a little bit differently, would respond to you and say, it doesn't work. It's too boring. They're going to go bananas. They're not interested. They're competing with Netflix and Hulu and HBO Max and Disney Plus. I'm just listing all the things that I compete with for my attention. And what really works is, schmoozing, talking, kumsas. It doesn't work what you're suggesting. What are we losing by not listening to you? Why does that have an impact?
First of all, when you teach Jewish texts, including things like the Siddur, which you daven from every day, in translation, you are teaching Torah at a remove from the power of the authentic text itself. And look, I've read War and Peace in translation. Actually, I read War and Peace in two separate translations. And it might be worth learning Russian just to read Anna Karenina in the original. I'm kidding. I don't have time. But it's clear to me that I'm reading it in translation and that the Russian reader is getting something far more profound than what I'm getting. And that's just the nature of translation. When you're learning Torah in translation, when you're davening essentially in translation, you are not doing the real thing. That's A. B, you could give students, if they have good language skills and if they have good reading skills, you can give them texts that will answer their questions, right? Instead of walking in and telling the student what the Michtav Me'Eliyahu said, or what what the Shemi Shmuel said, or what the Rambam said on faith, or on Bechira Chofshit, free will, or whatever it is, they could actually read that stuff themselves and ask questions about it and be confident of getting an answer. And I think the tragedy is that the American Jewish community has invested so much money, so much time, so much energy in the Jewish educational system, but they haven't professionalized it. They will take anybody as a teacher. They don't give their teachers skills. I mean, you got me on my hobby horse here, but
Yeah, I see.
this is absolutely something I feel very passionately about, because if you are reading or learning a filtered tradition, it's automatically going to have less power for you.
It really resonates to me. Listening to you, my only regret is that I've only discovered you so late in my life, because aside from our Farockaway connection, which I am not dismissing, we're landsmen. I think the profundity and sophistication with which you share ideas is something that is so desperately needed. And specifically and again, I don't want to come back to this, maybe you'll say a word about it, the gendered component, in that as a female teacher sharing Torah at this level with this style and cadence and the rhythm with which you share these ideas of great sophistication is something that I'm always looking for more entryways
Told
for
you,
that.
it's an advantage. People walk past me in the street, they see the snoot, and they say, Yerushalmi Remsen, but there it is. Then I surprise them.
I always end my interviews with more rapid fire questions, and I was wondering if you would indulge me in three of those. My first question is, if you were looking for a book to introduce somebody to faith, somebody who is in doubt, somebody who is searching to ground their faith on something they will find meaningful in this very indeterminate postmodern world that we all live in, what is the book or books that you would give them?
Okay, Mayer Schiller wrote a book. I don't remember the title. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I know exactly what you're talking about. It's out of print and a little bit hard to find, but I will look to find that, and we could post that link. Absolutely. It's The Road. I think it has some road.
The Road I don't remember what it's called. It's a good book. Mayer Schiller's book.
The Road Back: A Discovery of Judaism.
Yeah. So that's one book I would recommend. And for somebody who wants a less intense overview, I still think Herman Wouk wrote a good book. It's a little apologetic, but this is a person who is speaking with great love of his faith and a willingness to maintain his faith in the face of an America that was even more assimilation oriented than our own. So I would say those two books.
I love that we gave Herman Wouk a shout out. He's kind of lost to the contemporary contemporary generation. They don't remember the movies. They don't remember, the books and his fame. So it resonates less. But imagine, a major author,
Steven Spielberg, right? Yeah.
Steven Spielberg, writing about faith in a really eloquent and sophisticated way. My next question I always ask, if somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical for as long as you needed to go back to school and get a PhD, what do you think the topic and title of your dissertation would be?
That's a good question. Probably something on the Ramban or maybe Mefarshe Rashi. Or, what would be really cool? Probably there aren't too many doctorates out on that. The Nitziv.
Well, Gil Pearl wrote on the Netziv, but there's more to do. There's more to do on the Netziv.
Like, duh. Of course there's more to do.
My wish list, and there's anybody to do it, and if anybody gives this sum of money, I'm still waiting for a PhD on Rav Menachem Kasher.
Oh.
For people who are interested
Torah
in...
Shlema. Yeah.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Do a full PhD on that. My final question, I'm always curious about people's schedules. What time do you go to sleep at night, and what time do you wake up in the morning?
Pre-corona or post-corona?
Let's do post-corona. Why not?
Okay. So I'm doing a lot of Zoom teaching at the moment at relatively late night hours to Chutz La'aretz. So
America, yeah.
yeah. So I'm in England.
And England, yeah.
And other places too. I have students from as far away as Prague. So my schedule's kind of messed up because I've been going to bed very late. I would say on it pre-corona,
Yeah.
I'd say about midnight.
Okay.
And about between 6:30 and 7 in the morning.
You wake up.
Yeah.
Simi Peters, I'm just so excited for your writings and thoughts, specifically shared in this volume to come out. We will definitely amplify it because I think it's that important. And for your time, effort, and ideas, I am so appreciative to you. Thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
There are some people who are going to find Simi Peters' approach, and again, you could check out in the volume. Hopefully she's going to publish it in a shorter version, incredibly unsatisfying. In many ways, it repeats what others have said quite eloquently, whether it is Rav Yaakov Emden in the introduction to a Siddur, I believe, makes an argument from Jewish peoplehood itself, whether it is the beautiful essay published in 1899 by Mark Twain concerning the Jews, which I think is one of the most moving essays ever, where he really talks about the secret, the immortality of the Jewish people. I'll read a snippet for you now because I do find it so moving. If the statistics are right, and this is Mark Twain concerning the Jews, published in Harper's in 1899, if the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous dim puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of, has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contribution to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are also way out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in this world, in all the ages, and has done it with his hands tied behind him. He could be vain of himself and be excused for it. The Egyptian, the Babylonian, and the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed, and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other peoples have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in twilight now or have vanished. The Jew saw them all, beat them all, and now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energy, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? And when I read that, I never cease to be moved. I always find these words to be incredibly moving, and for some, maybe they've heard it so many times already that they dismiss it, and maybe for some, they'll find some ideas and reasons of why this doesn't count as some form of evidence to couch your very faith into, and I have no doubt that there are mounds of responses why this is an absurd reason to couch your faith into. But on a very personal level for myself, I do believe that my connection to the Jewish people is a form of revelation of sorts. I've never heard God speak to me as an individual, but I do connect to godliness as he is revealed through the entirety of the Jewish people and the story of the Jewish people, and being able to connect to that grand narrative and that grand story, and ensuring that I'm able to continue that story with those who continue after me, for me personally, is a very powerful reason to justify my own faith and continue to hear the whispers of God and revelation through the history and future of the Jewish people. So thank you so much for listening. It wouldn't be a Jewish podcast without a little bit of Jewish guilt. So if you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also, a new feature, leave us a voicemail with feedback, questions that we could play in a future episode. Don't freak out, we could do it anonymously. Just let us know if you want us to use your name. And that number is 917-720-5629. Again, our voicemail is 917-720-5629. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word 40, F-O-R-T-Y, 18, F-O-R-T-Y.org, 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.